Welcome back to the channel. In my last video, I spoke about how we can increase training frequency to build more muscle. Today, I'm going to be speaking about how we can set up our training week to improve performance. In fitness, we see training principles get taken really far in one direction. And in the case of increasing training frequency, we can see the popularity of everyday muscle part training programs be popularized more and more. But the biggest problem with this is that once you pass that beginner phase where you can just look at a weight and gain muscle, the efficacy of training like this starts to drop off really quickly. And when we start training greater than 4 sets in a session, recovery is probably going to start being hindered, or it's not going to be there to train just as hard in the subsequent training day. So we're going to look at how we can set up your training week in a way that we can improve performance. And when it comes to powerlifting or more strength and conditioning focused goals, where we're training multiple qualities concurrently, this becomes more and more important. The easiest example to see this in is in the powerlifter that's trying to train bench press more than twice per week. It just doesn't make sense logistically for the athlete to be able to be fully recovered in their bench press. So say for example, they hit a max effort bench press on day 1. For day 2, if they're going to be hitting bench press again, chances are they're not going to be fully recovered. So how can we set up the training week in a way that is going to increase the chances for improved performance? Just to preface all of this, we're going to talk about, I guess, what the optimal training frequency is, just so I don't leave that unfinished. It's whatever you're able to fully recover from, and in terms of body composition, I think that becomes more and more important. But when we start talking about training for the power lifts or when training multiple fitness qualities, it starts to be really important to classify what we organize as higher intensity stresses or higher fatigue stresses and then lower fatigue stresses. Because like I said earlier, it's not going to be possible for us to be fully recovered for some exercises or some training days. The way that we remedy this is by structuring our training week in a specific way, and we'll go through some worked examples a little bit later. The classification of these stresses is probably the most important thing to go through before we go into that example. The way we look at it, this is not ours. This has been popularized by Charlie Francis, a famous sprint coach. A lot of strength and conditioning coaches quote his work, and we're just going to pretty much run through what he's classified as higher or lower intensity stresses, and then we're going to talk about that in our specific context. So in higher intensity stresses, we look at things of high absolute loads. So for this, there'd be the comp lift. If you think about the bench press as opposed to a bench press variation, like a tempo or a pause bench, you're probably going to be able to put higher numbers out on a standard bench press. Whereas if you look at a tempo or a pause bench press or a long pause bench press, you're probably not going to be able to lift as much load. So higher absolute loads would come under the higher intensity stresses. And then we look at things of higher relative intensity. So the closer we are to failure, things that are of an RPE 8 and above or an RIR of 2 or less. Power and plyometric work come under this banner as well. So things like sprints, top effort sprints, jumps and plyometrics, and then maximum effort throws. And then high intensity conditioning. So if you think of your high end aerobic power work, that would come under the higher intensity stresses here. And we'll look at our lower intensity stresses, so things of lower absolute loads. I spoke about this a little bit earlier. So our technical variation, so our slow tempo work or our long pause work on any of the competition lifts. Things of a lower relative intensity, so lower than RPE 8. And then our general sort of systemic conditioning. And we do this by way of full body circuits or tempo intervals. And tempo intervals just like a lower intensity interval, not maximum effort here. The example we're going to look at is just a standard week for the strength trainee looking to improve their performance in the comp lift. It's probably going to be biased towards full body every day just because of the structure of a week and the way the big lifts are. We've got squat, bench and deadlift, and then the accessories to go along with that. So just by force of what we're doing, we have to structure it in a full body way. So if we have a look at day 1 and day 2 here, we've got our competition efforts, we've got some accessory lifts, and then we've got some secondary or technical lifts included as well. So if we have a look at this, we've got our comp squat first up. Absolute loads are going to be higher, and prescribed RPEs or relative intensities are higher at the 7 to 9 RPE. The secondary lift is a 3-count pause bench press. In a technical variation, absolute loads are going to be a little bit lower, and just for the sake of the rest of the training week, prescribed relative intensities are a little bit lower at 6 to 8 RPE. And this becomes more important to see as we look at the second day. The second day, we've got our higher intensity day of our competition bench. Absolute loads are going to be higher because the pause isn't going to be as long, or there isn't a tempo imposed on the movement. Reps are a little bit lower, so again, absolute loads higher. The relative intensities are higher as well at a prescribed 7 to 9 RPE. The secondary lift for today is an SSB split squat. And if we look at the SSB split squat as opposed to the comp squat, the absolute load used is going to be lower. Again, RPEs prescribed are between 6 to 8, so relative intensities are lower here. And not only does this improve the potential for performance on this day, but it also sets up the next day of training. In the next day of training, there's probably going to be a lower body lift, and judging by how we've structured this, we've got a higher intensity lower body, lower intensity lower body. Day 3 is probably going to be higher intensity again. By pulling back the relative intensity and the absolute loads used on day 2, we're improving the chances for improved performance on day 3. So you're probably thinking like, why do I need to do high and low every single day? If you're training hard enough and actually within the parameters of prescribed RPEs, you're probably going to be affected in the next day. Your recovery is not going to be there to be able to back up effort after effort after effort with high absolute loads and high, ranges of relative intensity. Set your training week up in a way that's going to increase or improve the chances for repeated performance in the training week. Doesn't matter if you train really well on day 1 and 2, but by day 3 and 4, you're absolute trash and you're actually not being able to replicate performance or progress in the previous session. All right, we're just going to run through one more quick example, and this is more, focused or biased towards someone that's going towards, more of that hybrid approach, lifting, jumping, and wanting that all-round sort of focused training program. So in day 1, we've got our power and plyometric movement, an upper body focus, our higher intensity bench press. Okay, so the absolute load is going to be a little bit higher here. RPEs will be between 7 and 9. And then we've got our secondary lift, lower body. The RPEs will be between 6 and 8, and lesser absolute load than you'd think with our main movement that we're going to be doing on day 2. Day 2, we haven't repeated the high intensity or the power movement for upper body. We've gone to lower body because we're probably going to improve chances for increased power by having a lower body movement instead. Our secondary lift, we've got our squat. Again, high absolute loads would be used here than they would in the split squat, and higher RPEs would be prescribed. I haven't written it there, but it'd be 7 to 9 RPE as opposed to the 6 to 8 for this secondary lift here. And then dumbbell bench press, the same. High repetitions, lower absolute load, and lower RPEs would be prescribed. So we've gone from our higher intensity work for upper body to lower intensity work on this, and then lower intensity to higher intensity. And this sort of undulation is going to allow for improved performance, especially when going towards that more full body, the full body structure of training programs. Now, this isn't the only way to structure a training week. Sometimes it's going to be impossible to actually do it like this. It's just a way to get you to start thinking about how one day is going to potentially affect performance on the next day and the next day and the next day. Structuring your week in a way, especially for strength and performance, that improves the chances for repeated performance is the way to go here. So just to cap this off, this sort of structure is biased towards those chasing more strength and performance-based goals. Increased training frequency of body parts. I think when we look at optimal training frequency, it's probably whatever you can recover from through the lens of body composition. But for strength and performance, sometimes it's just not possible. And this is why we look at training or structuring the training week through, I guess, the organisation of high and low stresses. If you have any questions about how to structure your training week or want to learn more about programming, get in touch with us or drop it in the comments below. Like, share and subscribe to the video. And as always, happy lifting. Subscribe to the video. I don't know, that's done. Thanks, guys.